In this video, we're going to explore a cutting-edge JavaScript feature by adding a new Babel plugin. This is going to add support for the class properties syntax. That's going to allow us to add properties right onto our classes as opposed to just methods. Currently, if I want to set up something simple like an object on the state prop, I have to go ahead and create the constructor function first. That's super tedious and it creates more work than we really need. Using this new syntax, we're also going to be able to avoid the need to manually bind all of our event handlers. And by the end of the video, the constructor function will actually be gone altogether. Now, like all new JavaScript features, the rollout is never perfect. Various JavaScript engines implement them whenever they're ready, not all at once, and browsers running older versions of JavaScript engines, they're never going to see this feature. And that's why we're using tools like Babel. It allows us to write ES6 today, and it compiles down to ES5 that all browsers understand. And what we're going to do right now is nothing different. So we're going to be setting up something new in the Babel RC file to add support for this new syntax. Let's go ahead and explore the plugin that we're going to be installing by going over to the Babel website, a place we've been plenty of times before. That's babeljs.io. And once we're here, we're going to go over to the plugins page where we've also been, docs, plugins. In the past, we used this page to explore the official presets. We installed env and React. What we're going to do now, though, is scroll down to the experimental presets. So TC39 is the organization that moves JavaScript forward, and there are various stages that a new feature can be in when it's introduced. Starting with stage 0, which is really just an idea. It may never actually end up in JavaScript, and if it does, it's most likely going to be pretty different from how it's currently defined. And then we move on down to more stable versions all the way to when it's actually finished. What we're going to be looking at is a stage 2 preset, and this is a stage 2 preset that's been around for quite some time. If we click over to there, we're going to be looking for the Transform Class Properties plugin. So as I mentioned, when we first installed Babel, presets are just a collection of plugins. This time around, though, we're actually just going to be installing an individual plugin. This is the plugin that lets us use that new class property syntax. If we scroll down right here, we can see exactly what this new syntax is going to let us do. You can see that on this Bork class, they are defining an instance property, which is equal to a string right here in the curly braces, as opposed to a method. They're also defining a function that's not an ES6 class method. This is an arrow function. Arrow functions don't have their own in this binding, so we're not going to need to manually adjust the binding. This inside of bound function is always going to refer to the class instance. Using these two features, we're going to be able to vastly simplify our class-based components. Before we can do any of that, though, we do have to go ahead and install this. Down below, there are instructions for how to get that done. Essentially, we just run a really long command and we add one thing to Babel RC. That is exactly what we're going to do right now, starting with the installation command over inside of the terminal. Yarn add, and the name of the plugin is Babel plugin, transform, class properties. Has a real nice ring to it. And we're going to be grabbing the most recent version, that would be 6.24.1. Now go ahead and double check that for typos. It is quite a long one, but once you do have the correct command, we can just go ahead and install it locally. Now all we need to do before we can actually use the feature is configure it inside of Babel RC. Currently, we've only used presets, which are groups of plugins. We now have an individual plugin, and we set that up using the plugins array. This sits alongside of presets. Inside of here, we just provide the name of the plugin we want to use. Now, the Babel plugin prefix actually gets left off, which means right here, we can just type transform, class, properties. Perfect. Now, if we save Babel RC, our Babel configuration is set up to use this brand new feature. All we need to do before we actually write some code is to start up our dev server once again. I'm going to clear the terminal output and run yarn run dev server. And once the dev server is up and running, we're just going to confirm it's working by heading over to the browser. If we refresh things, we should see our application working as expected. Now let's go ahead and mess around with the new syntax, taking a quick peek at what it gives us. Down below, I'm going to create two classes, one that uses the old syntax and one that uses the new syntax. That's going to allow us to compare and contrast the two techniques. First up, a class old syntax. Now, if we wanted to set up an instance property on every instance of old syntax, we would do that by creating the constructor function and setting this dot whatever equal to some value. We can go ahead and do that for old syntax. Constructor. On here, this dot, we'll go ahead and use name, and we're just going to set it equal to a string, Mike, for example. Though we know we could put any value on here we wanted, like an object, Boolean, function, or whatever. Now, if we go ahead and create an instance, const, old syntax, we'll be able to view that property. I'm going to set it equal to a new instance of old syntax. And I'm going to go ahead and fix my typing. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and just dump this to the screen. Console.log. Old syntax. This is going to show us what makes up this instance. It is an instance of old syntax. We see the class name right there. And this instance has a single property name set to Mike. So we have to create a constructor function just to define this one instance value. What we're going to do is explore how we can do this a different way using the new syntax. And I'm just going to put a little spacer here to break up this file. Right here, we're going to make a class called new syntax, and we're going to use the new class properties to get that done. Down below, let's go ahead and create an instance first. Const new syntax equals new syntax. Then we're going to go ahead and log it to the screen. Console.log, logging out the instance variable. Perfect. If we do this, we are going to see that the instance is an instance of new syntax, and we have no class properties. Now, aside from setting up the constructor function, we can now define those right in line. We can set up key value pairs. Key equals something. So for example, name equals Jen. Now you'll notice that for this particular example, I'm not using any sort of variable type like var, let, or const. That is not something we do. Instead, we just define the name right away. We set it equal to something. In this case, it's a string, but it could be any type at all. Now the end result is that if we save the file and view the output, we can see that our instance of new syntax now has that value set up. Name is set equal to Jen, and we were able to do this without needing to define the constructor function. We're going to be using this exact same approach inside of our class-based components. So let's close down BabelRC, Webpack config, and package.json. I am going to leave add option open. That is one of our two class-based components. And I'm going to crack open indecision app, which is the other. So right here, what do we have? We have this .state set in the constructor function, and we just learned how we could fix that. Instead, we just set it up above. Setting state equal to, then we're going to go ahead and set it equal to an object, which is exactly what we want. And we're going to define the same values we would have down below. Error starts off at undefined. Now that we have this in place, we can actually remove the need for that altogether. In a little bit, we'll also be removing the need for binding, so we'll delete the constructor function altogether. But for now, we're just going to take things one step at a time. If I save add option, we can make sure things are still working as expected. By default, we're not seeing an error, which is good. And if I submit an invalid form, the error shows up. If I were to add a new item, a valid one, the error goes away and the new item shows. Everything is still working as expected, even though we've set up the state like this. Now let's go ahead and explore the other advantage of using the class properties syntax. That is the ability to create functions that aren't going to have their binding messed up. So we already know that it's really easy to mess up the this binding. Right here, I'm going to create a method getGreeting. And getGreeting is just going to return a template string. And we will say, hi, my name is, period. And we'll just toss the name right here with the $ curly braces syntax, referencing this .name. Now this is going to work if we were to call it on old syntax. Right here, old syntax.getGreeting. We call it, we get our string back, the string gets logged, the end result is, hi, my name is Mike Prince. But we know that it's really easy to break that binding, especially for event handlers. If I pull that off into its own variable, we can see that. Const getGreeting equals old syntax.getGreeting. So instead of calling old syntax.getGreeting, we are storing it in a variable, which we'll call later. And we can do that down below. Now I'm calling getGreeting. And if I do that, what do we get? we get an error. Type error, cannot read property name of undefined. That is because we broke the this binding. This is now undefined. We no longer have access to those instance properties. Now, how did we fix that? We fixed that through an annoying process. This dot get greeting equals this dot get greeting again, and then binding it to the component instance. This does indeed fix the problem, but it's not exactly the most elegant solution. So let's look at how we can fix that using class properties. We're going to set a new class property on new syntax, get greeting. I'm going to go ahead and set this equal to, and right here, we're going to use an arrow function. Now, arrow functions, as we know, they don't have their own this binding. Instead, they just use whatever this binding is in the parent scope. And for classes, that is the class instance, which basically means that the get greeting function is always going to be bound to the class instance. So for our purposes, we can add the exact same code in. I'll just copy it and paste it. Then we're going to go ahead and try to break the binding. So right here, const new get greeting, since get greeting is already taken, and we'll set it equal to new syntax dot get greeting. Now we're going to go ahead and call new get greeting. In the past, we saw this broke things, but when we use the class properties syntax, we're going to see that it actually works. So it's impossible to break that binding because arrow functions don't bind their own this value. They're just going to use whatever this is in scope, and for arrow functions on class properties, that is the class instance itself. So this is going to be fantastic for our event handlers. Inside of add option, for example, we can take handle add option and break that out into a class property as opposed to needing to bind it manually in the constructor. That means we can actually remove the constructor completely and just convert this over. Now we could retype all of this out, or we could just convert it, setting handle add option equal to an arrow function. All we got to do is toss the arrow in, and there we have it. Handle add option is now a class property, and it doesn't need to get bound manually, though everything is still going to work. So if I submit the form, we can see the error still is showing, and that's only happening because this is running with the correct context for this. So these are the techniques that we're going to be using. We're going to be using class properties to set up default state values, and we're going to be using class properties to set up our event handlers. We're still going to continue to use regular ES6 methods for all of those built-in React methods, whether it's something like render or whether it's something like component did mount or component did update. Now it is your turn. Your challenge for this video is to convert this component to using the class syntax. So step one is to pull the state out of constructor. Then you are going to go ahead and convert all 4 event handlers to class properties, and those will be arrow functions. And then finally, you can delete the constructor completely. Now go through those 3 steps just like we went through them for add options. So you're going to pull out the state, you're going to convert those event handlers, and what I'd also like you to do is put things in order. So you're going to start with class properties and end with the methods. So things like component did mount, component did update, and render, those should be near the bottom of the definition. And all of our event handlers, those should get moved up top. You can put them just below where you set up the state at the very top of the class. Take as much time as you need to knock that one out. When you're done, test your work, save the file, and mess around with the application, ensuring it's still working. Then you can go ahead and click play. How'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to use the new class properties syntax to improve the overall feel of this component. Right here, we're going to kick things off by just setting state equal to an object, and we're going to put the exact same values on there, options, which is just an empty array. Now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and move on to the next thing, which is going to be all of our methods. Those are going to get defined right down below. Now I know that I'm going to remove this and convert all of them, so I'm just going to delete the constructor function right now, and I'm going to get things in the proper order as well by grabbing handle delete options, handle delete option, handle pick, and handle add option. I'm going to cut all 4 out, removing them, and I'm going to paste them right here. Now all we need to do is convert these from being ES6 methods over to being class properties. I'm going to set this equal to, convert it over to an arrow function, and toss a semicolon on the end. And we can do the exact same thing for these two. Setting it equal to, we have to add the arrow in arrow function, toss on a semicolon, and we're done. Just two more left to go. We're going to set handle pick equal to an arrow function, and we'll do the exact same thing for handle add option. Perfect. And that is all we need to do. Now we don't have that annoying constructor function. There's no need to worry about manually binding things. We can just write our code, not having to worry about things like that. So over inside of the browser, our application seems to have worked correctly. It's at least loading without an error. Let's go ahead and mess around with it. I'm going to pick an option shows up. I'm going to remove an option. I'm going to remove all. It appears that everything is working as expected. There we have it. We've successfully converted all of our class-based components over to the brand new class properties syntax. Let's go ahead and clean some stuff up. I'm going to go ahead and remove the old syntax and new syntax classes. Now that we've integrated that feature, there's no need for those. And inside of add option, I am going to add on that missing semicolon right here. Perfect. That's it for this video. Let's take a quick moment to recap what we did. In this one, we installed and set up a brand new Babel plugin, which allows us to access a cutting edge feature. In this case, it was the transform class properties syntax that allowed us to customize how we use classes in our application. Here, we are now able to set up the state outside of the constructor function, and we are also able to set those class properties equal to arrow functions. This is a great candidate for things like our event handlers. Event handlers usually have a problem maintaining this binding with arrow functions. That is not something we have to worry about. We did that for add option, and we also did it for indecision app. Not only is that it for this video, that is it for this section. In this section, we set up Webpack from scratch, and it really wasn't that bad. It was 21 lines of code to get everything configured. The hard part was figuring out how to use all of the features it comes with. Import, export, the ability to do awesome stuff like importing third-party modules. But now that we have all of that in place, we have a much more scalable architecture. Each component lives in a file in this folder, and there's just one component per file, which means if you do want to find something, you can find it and locate it really easily. We were also able to set up the dev server and source maps, making our development just a little bit smoother. And that's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one.